The official fear of America's wrath made the Lebanese state prefer to strangle people than welcome Iranian support that could ease some of the suffering. Nevertheless, Hezbollah took over the task, establishing equations that could no longer be overlooked, either locally or regionally. Convoys of tankers loaded with Iranian diesel continued to make their way to the city of Baalbek and its surroundings, traversing a distance of more than 230 kilometers to store its cargo in tank depots prepared by the Amana Stations Company as a first step before distributing it to the targeted institutions from the Iranian cargo ship that had docked last week in the Syrian port of Banias. The first batch of convoys consisted of 80 tankers divided into 4 groups, traveling successively with an interval of about an hour between the convoy and the other to reduce congestion and to ensure safety on public roads. Each group included 20 tanks, meaning that the total tonnage that reached Baalbek the first day was 4 million liters, and the full load of the ship will arrive in the region in the upcoming days. Although Hezbollah leadership in the Beqa announced the cancellation of all the celebrations and receptions that had completed its preparations, in compliance with the statement issued by the Secretary General of the party, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, prior to the arrival of the first convoy, people still flocked to the public roads, spraying the convoy with flowers in celebrations for this new victory. The roads were also decorated with banners of thanks to the Islamic Republic of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. Banners, Lebanese flags, pictures of Sayyid Nasrallah, and Hezbollah slogans were raised along the main roads and squares that the convoys traveled through. In front of the convoys, flags of the United States of America and Israel on the ground to trample it with their tires in show of defiance to the American unilateral coercive measures to ensure siege against Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. The siege has been broken. Caesar's Act has been bypassed, and the peoples of the region have made their choice once and for all. Self-determination is a right, and we shall practice that right in broad daylight. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Lebanese Resistance Hezbollah trucked more than 1 million gallons of Iranian diesel fuel into Lebanon from Syria on Thursday, celebrating the move as a way of spiting the United States while bringing much-needed aid to a country nearly paralyzed by fuel shortages. With Lebanon suffering one of the worst economic collapses in modern history, Hezbollah managed to come out as a national savior, stepping in where the Lebanese government and its Western backers had failed. The fuel delivery, which Hezbollah said was the first installment of more than 13 million gallons, underscored the severity of Lebanon's crisis, as well as the government's failure to address it. To discuss this issue with us in Beirut is Dr. Yahya Ghaddar, Secretary General of the Global Gathering in support of the choice of resistance. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Ghaddar. Now, Hezbollah trucked last week more than 1 million gallons of Iranian diesel into Lebanon, flouting U.S. sanctions and coming out as a savior to a suffering population. Now, for weeks, the U.S. assets and, if you will, puppets in Lebanon, they were criticizing this move, saying it was mere propaganda and will never happen, and now it did, just before their own eyes. Will the U.S. afford this sort of defeat in a small country like Lebanon?
In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. The defeat of the United States and Lebanon became a reality and exposed its absolute importance, as all its local tools are weak and no longer have any elements of strength after it spent billions of dollars on NGOs and groups that did nothing to benefit the U.S. As per this new condition, after it was behind the failure of forming any government, as it was responsible for Hariri's first resignation after the popular uprising of 2019, it was not of interest for the U.S. to see any government formation in Lebanon. So when the life-saving Iranian fuel ship was confirmed by Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the balance of power shifted, which prompted the US to move fast and steal the show by allowing the government formation, which means that even this government formation was done against the will of the Americans. However, the US will try to maneuver using new ways, but it will be defeated again, as it was defeated before. The balance of power has fundamentally changed. This small country defeated the US militarily when it expelled the Marines and the NATO in 1984, and defeated it when the Israelis were expelled under fire and without negotiations, and also defeated it by importing Iranian oil, hopefully with new victories to come.
Well, Dr. Ghadar, USA Senate Foreign Relations Committee member Jim Risch said that, and I quote here, he said, Lebanon's receipt of US-sanctioned Iranian fuel trucked in by Hezbollah through Syria is a disappointing sign for the future of Lebanon's accountability and democracy, and that US sanctions must mean something, end quote. What does he mean by accountability, and why are we suddenly a disappointment of a democracy when we decided to seek the help of our regional friends and our regional allies to try and rid the country from the crisis of fuel?
The US always says anything without thinking. Importing Iranian oil has nothing to do with democracy. Our democracy has produced a parliamentary majority and institutions in Lebanon, and it is the one that makes decisions without blatant American interference. The American way of speech is a blatant interference in Lebanese internal affairs. This fully expresses the failure of America's plans to blackmail the institutions and to impose its own agenda on the Lebanese government. When it failed utterly in achieving its goals, the US began throwing accusations left and right. This is a complete collapse of the American hegemony and its assets in Lebanon.
Well, Dr. Ghadar, nearly every step of the fuel's journey was a challenge to the United States of America, which has imposed sanctions on the purchase of Iranian oil and on the Syrian government and on Hezbollah. Now, also on Hezbollah-linked companies, especially like the one that is distributing the fuel inside of Lebanon. Are we to expect some sort of a breaking of new monopolies by the same resistance or the axis of resistance in the fields maybe of, let's say, pharmaceuticals or maybe other monopolies? Because, for example, drugs are nowhere to be found right now in Lebanon. So might actually the resistance step up and stop the hoardings and maybe halt the work of the cartels?
It was obvious that when the resistance and Sayyid Nasrallah took the decision to import Iranian fuel, they only did so when there was no other option left after the government had failed to perform its role. And when the deep state represented by the oligarchy, the monopolists, cartels and banks presented only chaos and was responsible for blocking any real solutions in Lebanon, the resistance decided to break all sieges, including pharmaceutical and food products, and it will also break all the hoarding done by cartels and deep state lobbyists. I believe the new resistance plan has been launched at the moment the first Iranian fuel ship left the docks in Iran. No one will be able to stop this plan unless the new cabinet is ready to put forth real solutions, which is yet to be seen.
Well, anti-resistance camp in Lebanon is claiming that stepping in where the state has failed was a political coup for Hezbollah. Do you actually agree with that? And do you think that's really what happened in Lebanon? Was it a coup in Lebanon?
It is truly surreal that this anti-resistance camp in Lebanon has not yet realized that what this resistance says, it actually does. This is the same resistance that liberated South Lebanon in the year 2000 and claimed victory in the 2006 war, and later on claimed victory over terrorism and Takfiri groups, which was miraculous for many. And yet this anti-resistance camp thinks that this resistance is ready to be defeated. And yet this anti-resistance camp thinks that this resistance is ready to be defeated is ready to be killed and starved? Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has said it multiple times that come what may, the resistance will always stand beside any Lebanese government, and we will keep giving our hand out to help it, unless the day comes when any said cabinet demands the disarmament of the Lebanese resistance, demands our starvation or our death. If that day comes where you threaten to starve us just to disarm us, then our arms will always remain safe and will do whatever is possible so we don't starve. And we will do whatever is possible so we won't starve, and we will kill you instead. His words are crystal clear. What the resistance did was a national, popular and social measure to prevent monopoly, impoverishment and starvation, and to meet the people's needs and prevent their humiliation. It does not involve any coup measures. The Lebanese economy is a free one and monopoly is illegal. Rather, free competition should be activated. The resistance imported the oil derivatives in Lebanese pounds and through Lebanese merchants and companies, and distributed them through Lebanese companies, and most of these derivatives are being given away for free for humanitarian and medical institutions.
Well, we will continue talking about this with Dr. Ghadar after the break, but we will go for a break and then return and see how Hezbollah was able to break the taboo imposed by the Americans. Hezbollah's move, although confined to the economic aspect of mitigating the impact of the scarcity of fuel in Lebanon, it opens the door wide to the possibility of cooperation with Syria, Iran, and other countries, which Lebanon was forbidden by the US to deal with until recently. It also puts on the decision-makers' table in Lebanon and the countries concerned with the Lebanese affairs a new factor that was not taken into account. There are alternative options for the Lebanese rather than wait for breadcrumbs of Western and Persian Arab Gulf aid. And the more the American noose tightens on Lebanon, the more it will be forced to break US-imposed prohibitions in return. Hezbollah breaks the American fuel taboo in this following report. The matter has been settled. The Lebanese government permanently lifted the fuel subsidy without agreeing on a price for the gallon in Lebanese pounds, which doubled the problem for the dollarization of diesel fuel and the cost to the people. As for gasoline, it was agreed to enter the semi-final stage of lifting the subsidy so that the gallon would be sold starting Saturday at a price of 12,000 lira to the dollar. And when the subsidized quantity ends, the Lebanese central bank will sell the dollars, which it does not own to begin with, to the importing companies according to the black market exchange rate. Officially, the population in Lebanon has entered the most difficult part of the crisis and will not have the necessary tools to face the consequences of the collapse because the political authority decided to execute them by lifting subsidies before securing an alternative. Here comes the necessity for the Iranian fuel brought into Lebanon by Hezbollah through the Syrian port of Banyas. Iran's fuel will help save millions of Lebanese people as we approach the cold winter, despite the ridiculous attempt by the anti-resistance camp to demonize the step, calling it Hezbollah's coup in Lebanon. New Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati, for instance, thanked what he called his Arab brothers for their, quote, constant support for Lebanon, unquote, pledging them for God knows what reason that, quote, Lebanon has not and will not be an arena for offending Arab countries, unquote. This, thanks to Mikati's brothers, was withheld from the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding sending fuel to Lebanon. He did not dare to thank Iran or salute her. Rather, he decided from an American platform to sell a position to his Western and Arab allies and to express that he was, quote, sad about the violation of Lebanon's sovereignty because the process took place in isolation from the Lebanese government, unquote. However, all this nonsensical denunciation is irrelevant. What matters for the Lebanese public is that the first convoy of Iranian diesel entered Lebanese borders, dedicated to a reality that until recently was just an unrealizable possibility. Lebanese official fear of America's wrath has made the state prefer to strangle people than welcome Iranian support that could ease some of the suffering. Nevertheless, Hezbollah took over the task, establishing equations that could no longer be overlooked, either locally or regionally. While the government was dealing with the event as if it had not happened, it did not hesitate to launch its journey with a decision to lift the subsidy without waiting for the public financial aid card, which is still facing many problems before its launching. The achievement of Hezbollah, which defied the American unilateral coercive measures and the monopoly of fuel, which practically broke the public, would not have been achieved without the dedication of Hezbollah and the axis of resistance, new equations in the region, especially in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. These equations, which allowed Hezbollah to break the siege on Lebanon, are what forced the United States of America to overturn its previous plans and hurry to open the doors of solutions, whether it was politically by forming the government or energy by excluding gas and electricity from the effects of Caesar's law. Now we continue from Beirut with Dr. Yahya Ghaddar, Secretary General of the Global Gathering in support of the choice of resistance. Dr. Ghaddar, tanks carrying Iranian diesel entered the Baalbek-Hermel region from Syria, awaiting distribution through a mechanism that was announced by Hezbollah. Now, the public rejoiced, as we saw in the report, but the anti-resistance camp called it a coup. The Americans called it a disappointment, and the new Prime Minister of Lebanon, Najib Mikati, said, and I quote here, he's saddened about the violations of Lebanon's sovereignty, unquote, with this fuel. What's your take on this denunciation?
Well, this is funny. The people themselves will see who is indeed serving the interest of the homeland, the interest of the Lebanese people on the one hand, and who is besieging these people and is preventing their access to the vital needs of life. If diesel is not found, nothing will be working in the country, meaning that even food won't be available. The same applies to gas. Therefore, when these people denounce the one who brought forth the solutions, especially when nobody had foreseen that we will triumph over the enemy, the same American and Zionist enemy, along with their tools, who have been preventing any solution. Thus, the objective was to kill the Lebanese people. Hence, this step, which was appreciated by the Lebanese people in Akkar, Tripoli, South Lebanon, Beirut, and Bekaa, everywhere, the fact is that the Lebanese have seen who really serves their interest. As for the others, this step broke their back, the back of these forces, groups, political factions, and even some clergymen. It has also defeated political and media parties who had been propagating that it was impossible for the oil shipments to arrive. However, these statements have proven to be worthless and rather fall on deaf ears. This unveiled that these parties were accomplices with the American in plotting against Lebanon, starving its people and looting its wealth.
Dr. Ghaddar, Washington's efforts to prevent any mitigation of the consequences of the horrendous collapse in Lebanon, except through American measures that are in exchange for political concessions in Beirut, have been officially broken by Hezbollah's stance, just as you just explained right now in Lebanon. Yet it is obvious that the official Lebanese stance is one that complies with all what the U.S. dictates. What do you think the government's role, the new government's role, will be in the event Hezbollah decides to break other monopolies in the country, like the pharmaceuticals or maybe like oil drillings?
We don't really have high expectations for this cabinet. Nevertheless, there was a need to form this cabinet, for this measure has foiled the first step of the siege imposed by the U.S., which was to prevent the formation of a government. We wish that this government fulfills its duties. The resistance won't take any further steps if this state and this government is ready to take action and do its job. If the state really wants the resistance to stop taking further steps of rescue and aid, it has to shoulder their responsibilities. But it is clear that any decision to practically putting an end to monopolies will not be taken by the state. It is clear that the official institutions are under the mercy of the U.S., the side with which they are affiliated. Any power or ability that can prevent the steps or measures adopted to secure the life of the Lebanese, their pharmaceutical needs, food, electrical energy, gas, diesel, and all these needs, which are vital to all the people who are facing an unprecedented state of emergency, the like of which has never been seen in the world. No country has experienced what is happening in Lebanon. These needs necessitate a rescue act, and this resistance is ready and is always there to intercept with any action aiming to prevent it from confronting the political pressures. The resistance will carry out whatever is needed to serve the Lebanese people, regardless of what it takes to do so.
Well, Hezbollah's move proved that the reinforcement of a new deterrence equation in the face of the Israeli enemy, who did not dare to prevent the arrival of the ships by targeting them while they were maybe not in the sea, maybe on the shores of Syria, just as it did not dare to prevent the arrivals of the tanks loaded with the Iranian fuel from Syria into the Lebanese border. How do you think that will affect the future performance of the resistance in all of West Asia?
It is clear that all that you've mentioned in this question means that the resistance has triumphed. The resistance had already realized that it was to be victorious, because it has realized that the Zionist enemy and the US would not be able to take any action against whatever is relevant to Lebanese territories, and that those fuel vessels came under the banner of being Lebanese territories. That meant that any aggression against that Lebanese territory will lead to an open war, and of course, this is something that neither the Israelis nor the Americans wanted, because they realized that that would create huge problems and losses for them. Therefore, the resistance had the upper hand. It was the one which was able to impose its agenda and will. The fact is that the Israelis, the Americans, and their tools on the ground will no longer be able to prevent the resistance from achieving its goals and objectives, especially when these aim to serve Lebanon and the Lebanese people without any discrimination.
Well, the decision to execute people became an absolute reality in Lebanon last week when the government decided to lift all subsidies of the diesel fuel. Maybe after months of blackmailing the people and exerting maximum pressure on the people in such a very vital service like diesel. The threats of the past months issued by Central Bank Governor Riyad Salameh of lifting these subsidies were ignored by the political authority. They are now being implemented slowly, and they are leading to a transition to a more dangerous level of collapse in Lebanon. Is there anything that this new cabinet can do to probably just halt the inevitable fall of the Lebanese system?
It is clear that, as I have earlier stated, the US won't surrender. It has retreated, but it still has its tools, on top of which is the governor of the central bank, who is the cornerstone of financial and currency quagmire and the economic crisis that we are facing due to the lies he made and the hypocrisy he exercised since the beginning of the Beirut uprising, which was artificially instigated by the US. And he, the governor, has been a major part of this conspiracy. The Americans are trying, through lifting subsidies on everything, to create chaos once again. And this raises the question, can the resistance once again defeat the American in this field? Of course, the situation will be more difficult, but can this government do anything? I think that it can do a lot if it wills, and if there is an accord to prevent the country from collapse. But the cabinet has, first and foremost, to liberate itself from the American hegemony and to have consensus regarding fighting corruption and recovering the looted and smuggled deposits and restructuring the banking sector along with the central bank. Plus, there needs to be a decision to change the governor of the central bank. This is an essential point now, besides targeting the centers of corruption and monopoly. Lebanon is rich with its capabilities, powers, people, and resistance, and can, if the will is found, along with the political and social management, defeat everything. The tripartite equation that has defeated the usurping entity and terrorism will be able also to defeat this economic starvational chaotic, destructive project. The tripartite of the army, people, and resistance, these forces, thanks to the resistance, whether some like it or not, will be able to overcome all difficulties.
Secretary General of the Global Gathering in support of the choice of resistance, Dr. Yahya Ghaddar, thank you very much for being with us and giving this great form of information for our audience to learn about what's going on in Lebanon. Thank you very much for watching. Please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.